travelers, and welcome to the Traversing the Stars podcast. Today's special guest is J.M. DeMatteis. You know him as the writer behind Justice League International and Spider-Man's Kraven the Last Hunt. He is now writing Ben Reilly Spider-Man. Now come join me as we go Traversing the Stars. Hello, Mr. DeMatteis. Thank you so much for coming to the Traversing the Stars podcast.
Pleasure to be here.
It's 100% my pleasure. You are an absolute legend in the comic book industry, and it's fantastic to actually get to meet you in person. Oh, not exactly in person, but virtually in person.
Well, considering the past 2 years, this is as close to in person as we get these days.
That is extremely true. It's been a pretty big deal for the virtual world, the pandemic. It got everyone comfortable with Zoom. I never heard of Zoom even before COVID.
Neither had I. Neither had I.
It's going to be, just think about how many years from now we're going to be telling people, remember when before people knew each other on Zoom and we actually saw it in person and we had actual conversations at tables.
That's right.
So you're an absolute legend of comic book, as I said. What advice would you give a new writer about how to find voice of characters? Because you've done a spectacular job of doing that over
specifically decades. Finding characters' voices?
Yes.
Yeah, that's an interesting one because I've said this many times over the years, but if you're doing the job right, the story's kind of like a top. You set it spinning, and then it goes off on its own. And it's the same thing with the characters. You have to allow them to come alive. You sit down, you have your notes, you have your conception of what the story is, who the characters are, what you want them to do. But when things are really working, the characters really take on lives of their own, and you have to listen to them. It doesn't matter what your plan is, what you think you want them to do. You have to be able to listen to them and follow them where they want to go. They have to be as real to you as the flesh and blood people you know. And in some cases, they're more real because you know them more intimately than you know the flesh and blood people in your life, So I think to me, that's the key. And I always say, my job is to kind of get a little saw, cut off the top of their heads, get out a flashlight and root around and see what's going on in the darkest corners and the lightest corners of those psyches. And that's what will drive the story. Plot doesn't drive the story. For me, the plot grows around the characters.
Is there ever a concern about losing control of the character? Because once again, as you're writing them and letting them to dictate the story, is there ever concern that the plot will run away from you?
No, because usually when you want it to, that's my experience. Here's my other goofy metaphor. The story is a horse, right? So you're on this horse and you want to go like 6 miles that way, straight ahead. And you start to go, and the horse keeps pulling off to the left, and you're like, no, I want to go 6 miles that way. And finally you realize, no, the horse knows better than I do. And you kind of surrender and let it gallop off where it wants to go, Now, I'm not saying you don't need your basic skill set. I mean, at the beginning of any career, when I started in comics, which was at DC Comics back in the days of the anthology comics, they used to call them mystery comics because they couldn't call them horror, and you'd work on these little 6 and 8, and maybe if you got a big story, a 10-page story, but that you learned your craft. There were rules, there were regulations, there were certain things you had to do, certain things you couldn't do, and you had to get those basics down. You always need the basics down. But then once you get that down, you have to just, and even within the context of that, you may be in a specific box, but you still want your characters to come alive. You still want your story. If the story is surprising me, I know it'll surprise you.
I love the analogy that you gave about cutting open a character's head. For a moment, I had a picture in my head of the character Siler from the Heroes. That he takes I don't know if you've ever seen the show where he takes his finger and cuts off the person's head, then examines the brain. And you kind of see him doing that, like Siler picking up the character's head and examining the brain, seeing how it ticks.
But we always put everything back in and leave them intact when we're done.
That part is true. So one thing, like I said, when certain characters like Spider-Man, who has been written by many people over the years, when you're choosing to write that character and you're cutting off their head and seeing how they're ticking for you, do you feel like you need to connect with what other writers were seeing in that brain, or are you seeing how you want to make that character voice through your own ideas and thoughts about that character?
You need both. You need both because you have to be true to the character. To be true to the character, you have to know who their character was before you came along and what they've been through and what created them and what molded them. And then what you want to do is hopefully find something unique that speaks to you personally. Because that's the other thing I think advice I would give is it has to be personal. You have to connect with something that's very deeply personal in yourself to really make a great character and a great story. Even in something as quote lighthearted as our Justice League International, those characters had to be real within the context of those adventures. In fact, in some
Mm,
ways, I think because of the humor, they were even more real than some of these more dramatic characters.
mm,
So it has to be real. It has to be personal. I've done autobiographical comics, but I've said I've also put things into Spider-Man comics that are as deeply personal and as revealing as things that I put into autobiographical comics. The readers don't necessarily know that because it's coming through Peter Parker or Harry
mm.
Osborn or whoever it may be. But you want it to matter that much, and you want to essentially, a writer has to. I always say this, and I mean this metaphorically, boys and girls. Don't do this at home with a real knife. You have to take a knife and dig it into your chest and bleed onto the pages, metaphorically.
Be careful of the next combo that comes out is made in blood. The
Right,
blood. I'm
that's
just like
right.
they were listening to the interview just a little too closely at that moment.
Wasn't there a Kiss comic years ago where they printed it with Kiss blood or something like
I
that?
think I do remember there was someone who gave that try. And I think there also was a sneaker that someone used in the shoe their own blood. I can't remember I think it was like a rapper who made a particular type of shoe. I was like, wow, that's really a little too serious.
Right, right. I get it with Kiss; it fit their image, Um,
So when you're writing Spider-Man, what was that part of that character that you were able to key on as making it personal to you? Like I said, your run on Spider-Man is so well beloved.
oh, thank you. Yeah, Peter is just so multidimensional and so real, and for all the superheroics and everything else, for all the fact that he's really good at science and blah blah blah, that's not what I ever related to. He's a regular guy. He's the everyman. He's the everyman that puts on that mask, who tries his absolute best, fails spectacularly along the way, but will always get up again and try to do the right thing. And I think I relate to that because, like most of us, I am spectacularly flawed, but I am trying my best in my life to live a good and decent and compassionate life. And so is Peter, and I relate to that. And Peter, it's so interesting because with Peter, Jewish writers, Catholic writers, whatever your background is, we all seem to relate to him. And certainly, I have both a Jewish and a Catholic background, so that I relate to Peter's guilt tremendously. This is a character completely driven by guilt on so many levels, and if he does anything wrong, he's tortured by it. And I relate to that as well, because that's part of my own character, because if we try our best to do the right thing, and it's inevitable, being human, that we're going to screw up. And then some of us like to then go off and torture ourselves for having done that,
Yes.
So I relate to that. There's so much in Peter that I relate to because he seems so real to me.
You know, I wonder if a fair argument could be made that Spider-Man, or at least Peter Parker, is the most human of the combo characters.
I think so. I've always said that he is the most three-dimensional. If you're looking at the Marvel universe and the DC universe, he's the character that is the most real to me.
Now, you wrote one of the multiple famous storylines from Spider-Man, like I said, the Kraven's Last Hunt storyline, which was so beloved. I mean, that story, I mean, even in the movies, they once again go back to it and talk about it as being like one of the keys to understand the character, and how strong and tough he is. Do you think that is why people love him so much? It's just that toughness, that kind of like the inner willpower to overcome anything, no matter how flawed he is as an individual.
Yeah, that's it. I guess the word, when I think of the word tough, I think of something very macho. I don't think of Peter that way, but resilient.
Resilient.
And he has a very fierce will. He won't. If he's trying to do the right thing, he will see it through to the end. And it doesn't matter if it's the Juggernaut kicking him from here to the moon and back again. He'll go off, he'll lick his wounds, and he will come back, and he will keep trying to do the right thing. And even if in the end he fails, at least he will have failed trying to do the right thing.
Yeah, I mean, I always thought, like, if he was a DC character, he would be like Green Lantern. Like, he'd have the ring, because he has that kind of like willpower.
Yes, he does. He really does. That's a really
good
point. Yeah, that's true. He'd make a great Green Lantern.
You also wrote the Clone Saga with Ben Reilly, which is
Mhm.
based on the comic you're going for. And in the first issue of Ben Reilly Spider-Man, in what they call the Arachne Notes, you wrote that the story is both famous and infamous. Do you think over the years, when people have looked back at the Clone Saga, do you think it's become more embraced than it was when it first came out?
Oh, absolutely. Well, the joke is it was embraced when it first came out. When the Clone Saga started, it was a huge sales success, especially at a point, very shortly after that, when the business, when that bubble burst, that 90s bubbles burst, and the sales started going down, the Clone Saga was doing very, very well. It's we don't have to get into the whole thing, but one of the problems was that it dragged on and on and on and on, and then the powers that be at Marvel basically wanted to end it and bury it and bury everything associated with it. But there's a funny thing that happens in not just in comics, but in popular culture in general. People who were 12 years old at that point reading it are grown-ups now, and they read that and they loved it. You know what I mean? So it's sort of like, oh, that was my Spider-Man, that was my era, they say. And if you've seen in recent years, so many of these characters have come back. So much, Ben Reilly's in the main Spider-Man book, Dr. Kafka's in the main Spider-Man book, all these characters from that era. Kane has been a big player. So I always say there were a lot of serious problems with the Clone Saga, but there was a lot of great stuff in there and a lot of great characters, not the least of which was Ben.
Well, I will say that my era of Spider-Man was the Clone Saga. I started right around Maximum Carnage when that came out, because that storyline just looked amazing to me. I started buying that, and I bought all through the Clone Saga. And I will say that was my era of Spider-Man as well. I mean, I remember, Ben Reilly. I remember the stories so richly, and I thought that you can understand why people have come back to Ben Reilly. There's a character that, once again, is like Peter Parker, but there's this also increased layer. I mean, if it's even possible, increased layers of guilt and trouble of this character who's trying to define of whether or not he's genuine, like who he is in a very real way, not just because. I think we all struggle in some level who we are, but he's even struggling with, is he really someone who can acknowledge himself as being a person? Because obviously it's a clone. And I think that's just means such a rich character.
Yes, I always say he is Peter and he's not, because aside from the fact that he's given this information at one point that he's not even who he thinks he is. And I love stories of identity where where you play with the fact there's who I think I am versus who I really am, and how do I to find that truth in between. And then he goes off for 5 years under an assumed name because he can't be Peter anymore, and he has a rough time for 5 years. So when we find him in the Ben Reilly book, he's come back. Peter and Mary Jane have gone off to live there happily ever after, and I'm back in New York, but I can't be Peter Parker. Because everyone who knows Peter Parker thinks he's just moved to Portland with his wife. So now I've got this like fake blonde hair and this fake name and no life, except, the only life he really can relate to at this point is being Spider-Man, because that he knows. Yeah. He can put on a costume and do that. But as for who Ben Reilly is, he doesn't know. And one of the main arc of this series that just started in January, I think the second issue comes out next week, is that primal question: who am I, and how am I going to build a life? Can I find friends? Do I even deserve to have friends? Because a part of him still feels less than human and unworthy of all the things he's been given. And there's always that little doubt in the back of his head. Well, first I thought I was the clone, then they tell me I'm the real guy. Well, what if that's wrong? And what if and there's this whole question. With Ben, and at this point in time with Peter too, there's always in the back of both their minds like, what's going on here? What's real and what's not? And they may never know.
I think one testament to how genius you are as a writer is you're able to convey a lot in a very shorthand way. There's a moment at the beginning of Ben Reilly Spider-Man, the first issue, where he bumps into J. Jonah Jameson. And
I really like that scene.
Yeah, and he's angry about being recognized. And I think that anger being recognized, just because it's J. Jonah Jameson who recognizes him, but the anger of that moment of like maybe recognition that people still see him as as Peter Parker, but he can't be that guy.
Yes, exactly.
It's so rich, and I felt like you said so much about the character in that one moment of scene without even giving that exposition. I always hate exposition, and you bypass all of that by just giving this one scene and one reaction. It just speaks to everything.
And he says, Jonah's talking to him. He says, "I'm not Parker." And the minute he says that, Jonah sees something. And one of the points of that scene was, they are not the same guy, because he has been changed by this journey. And when you look into the eyes of this guy who's been on the road for 5 years, getting kicked around by life in a way even Peter hasn't been, and Jonah realizes, oh, sorry, he gets very flustered and he wants to get out of there really, really quick. I was very happy with that scene, and David Baldion, our artist, did a beautiful job bringing that to life.
So when you approach writing Ben Reilly, once again, you're writing a character who is Peter Parker, but not Peter Parker. Where is the line that you're writing in where you kind of need to touch on the Parkerness of him, but still keep it clear that it's not?
You know, the truth is I don't think about these things when I'm writing. I feel them. Do you know what I mean?
Mm.
It's much more of an intuitive thing. I know Ben. I know Ben like I know my best friend. So to write, I'm not thinking how what would Ben do here. I just know what he would do there. I know who he is. I know his reactions. I know his psychology and his emotions, and I just follow that. I follow the character. I follow Ben, and he tells me how it's going to go and how he's going to react.
Is that why you came back to the character? Is it like revisiting an old friend when
It
you?
really, really is. I said that to somebody recently. That you may have a really dear friend. You don't see them for 5 years, 10 years, sometimes longer than that, and then you see them again, and it's like you pick up exactly where you left off because you know each other so well. And it's like you were in mid sentence 10, 15 years ago, and you just pick up in mid sentence, and that's kind of what it is with these characters. It happened recently with Justice League Unlimited. We did a Justice League Infinity series for DC, and I hadn't written those characters since the early 2000s. But I know those characters, and off we went. Oh, here we are with this gang of my old friends. Let's go have fun.
So the character Ben Reilly Spider-Man takes place in the past of current continuity. I mean, right now, Amazing Spider-Man, he's in that book, but this is definitely pre that.
Yes, this is exactly in that moment where Peter and Mary Jane have left, and he steps into the role as Spider-Man. He's not the Scarlet Spider; he's Spider-Man. Yeah.
So why was that the point in the timeline that you wanted to come back to? Was Marvel did they come to you and say, do you want to write at this point, or did you decide, hey,
Yeah,
this
they,
is
they
where?
came to me with that idea. They wanted to do a Ben Reilly story from that era, and what we kind of realized was that moment. If you jump in the middle when he's already Spider-Man and already established, it's a whole different thing. At this moment, it's a crisis point, and you always want to be able to write from a crisis point for a character for it to be interesting. Because, as I said just a few minutes ago, he doesn't know. He's not sure who he is. He doesn't have a life. He doesn't have the supporting cast that developed later when he was in that era. He's really on his own trying to figure it all out, and that to me is a really interesting point to step into Ben's story.
And I think another, I mean, there's so many perfect character points you have in that book. And I mean, you should be hailed for every moment that you wrote that. There's so many great stuff.
Oh, thank you.
You're more than welcome. There's a moment where Ben Reilly says or suggests that he finds purpose in life as Spider-Man. And I think the important thing about that sentence is not that he finds purpose in Spider-Man, but that it implies he has no purpose when he's not Spider-Man. Or at least
Right.
at
At
that
this
moment.
moment, at this moment in time, that's exactly how he feels because he doesn't know. He's living in a dumpy apartment in the East Village. He just got this job at the coffee shop, so he hasn't been. And here is this brilliant guy, and what is he doing? He's sweeping up and giving people coffee and washing dishes in a coffee shop, and he's got nothing else. But when he puts on that mask and he puts on that costume, he knows he has an impact on the world. He knows he can help make the world a better place as Spider-Man. He knows what's expected of him, whereas as Ben, he has no clue.
Is living the kind of life that he's living, or working at a bar, is that a choice? Is that sort of I don't know if you know, I've seen the movie Good Will Hunting, where the genius janitor,
I
the
saw
janitor
it
is the super
years
genius,
ago. Yeah.
right? Where because obviously Ben Reilly, being basically Peter Parker, is an uber genius. He probably could do most types of jobs. Is he intentionally trying to avoid living that kind of life to not be noticed in that way, or make a wave?
Yeah, at this point, I think he very much is because he's not. There's a part of him that doesn't even think he deserves something more. He really is,
Hmm.
who still feels like an imposter. We all have those moments in our lives of imposter syndrome. Where
Yes.
I'm working one day and I'm like, oh, they're finally going to find out after all these years that I have no talent and the stories stink and I'm awful. There's always that sense, and Ben has that. It's just like he doesn't know. He doesn't know what he should do. So he's going to lay low, keep his head down, no friends, just go do this job, go be Spider-Man. But underneath that is this part of him that's desperate for connection. The story is called The Humanity Agenda that applies to our antagonist, who we haven't met yet, who's behind this whole thing, and to Ben himself, because they're both, as we'll see, seeking some kind of connection to humanity. As much as Ben is pushing everything and everyone away, he desperately wants that connection.
So at this moment of the story, though, Ben Reilly does believe that he was the true Peter Parker.
Yes, yes.
So knowing that the Peter Parker that's having the great life with Mary Jane is the false Peter Parker, the clone, you know what I'm saying, or at least not legitimate. how strong is the bitterness there that he's saying that this guy took over my life, and in many ways is not, I won't say a villain on some level, but is definitely got the person who cheated him out of what should have been his.
Right, right. Well, I think he understands that Peter didn't consciously cheat him out of anything. So he's not, on one level, he's not angry at Peter. He's happy for Peter. But if you go down to level 2 and 3, and we explore this in the course of the story, of course he resents Peter for this. He has to. There's, Peter is like a brother to him at this point. But you can really want to strangle your brother and throw him down a flight of stairs, can't you? So, look at any family, you know. And so I think it's a little bit of that. It's like he absolutely loves Peter and he absolutely resents Peter at the same time.
I mean, does he view Peter as, at least in part, an imposter?
I don't know if he would put it that way, because the truth is let's say that for the purposes of this argument, Peter is a clone. He is a replica of Ben. He's not, when you think of an imposter, you think of the chameleon, someone who's very consciously trying to take someone's place and pretend to be them. Peter isn't. Peter is, as far as Peter ever knew, he was Peter Parker. So he wasn't trying to take anything away from anybody. And that makes it even worse for Ben, actually, that Peter is a good guy, because he can't villainize him. He knows he's a good and decent guy, and yet this guy has the beautiful wife. He's got a baby on the way. He's got a good life. And what have I got? And I'm the real guy, and I've got nothing. There's a lot of resentment there for sure. But he has to work through that.
Now, the best villains are the ones that mirror the hero. And I'm thinking that you very intentionally chose the character of Carrion to be the first issue villain. There's a scene with the character Malcolm McBride, which is the alter ego of Carrion, who suggests that he needs Carrion to survive. And I'm wondering, is that mirroring Ben Reilly, who needs Spider-Man to survive? Was that an intentional mirroring of the characters?
Was it intentional? I don't know. But one of the things that drives me and interests me is the duality inside all of us. We all have that pull of opposites inside of us. That's what makes an interesting human being. That's what makes an interesting character. And certainly Ben has that. There's just the identity question of, am I Ben? Am I not Ben? Am I Peter? Am I Ben? Then there's, am I Ben? Am I Spider-Man? There's that whole tug of war between those two things. And the whole question with any of these characters, which is, if you're continually putting on a mask and becoming something else, who's the real person? Is it the guy in the costume with the mask on? Or is it the guy underneath? And I always say with Spider-Man, in the end, when you're writing a Spider-Man story, you're writing a Peter Parker story with mask on or mask off. You look at a character like Batman and you feel like sometimes he gets lost in the role and he loses Bruce Wayne along the way and he becomes this thing and he has to remember and pull back. So yeah, it's the duality, certainly the duality of Malcolm, that he's got this thing inside him that he hates, and yet we see in the story that he feels that he needs it. I don't want to give away why. We explain why in the story, that he actually needs Carrion inside him to help him through a very difficult time. So you'll find those things in a lot of my stories as sort of mirrors of duality within the hero and the villain, because we all have it. The hero has a villain inside him to some degree, and the villain has a hero inside him to some degree, as we all do.
And obviously, as you were talking about Ben Reilly, he has multiple masks on. Like you said, he has the Spider-Man mask. I guess, is Ben Reilly then the mask and Peter Parker the mask?
Well, Ben Reilly is a mask on some level for him, because he couldn't be Peter anymore, so he came up with this name and this identity and went off and traveled for 5 years and never was able to put down roots. So Ben never really became much of anything out there. He traveled the whole world for 5 years. So Ben is a mask, but he can't really be Peter. So Peter's a mask, Spider-Man's a mask. He's juggling masks at this point. And one of the things he has to become comfortable with being Ben Reilly and put down roots and build a life.
I mean, the character of Ben Reilly is so complex. I mean, it's not surprising that 20 years later, he has had a renaissance of popularity.
Yeah.
It's because he is, in many ways, extremely complex. I mean, in many ways, more complex than Peter Parker, who is in many ways extremely complex.
Yes, exactly. I've said the same thing. I've said the same exact thing.
So obviously, Ben Reilly is also a major character, dominant character in the current Amazing Spider-Man storyline, as you mentioned. Is the story's continuity connected to what you're doing? I mean, is there relationships between those two stories, or is this its own entity?
It's its own entity. Yeah, there's no major. I mean, like we know that Kafka is involved in the current Spider-Man storyline, and so she's here, and the fact that we're showing the development of that relationship in our story plays into that. But it was beyond that. These stories really exist on their own. You know, obviously it's the same character, so there
Mm.
will be things mirroring each other. But there was no plan to like, oh, and I'll put this in here and it will pay off over there. Nothing like that happening.
I mean, this is very much an insular story, right? I mean, the world of this storyline exists on its own.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, it is. You know, we say back in the '90s, but obviously in comic book time, it's not the '90s. It's
Right.
probably four years ago or something. You know,
Right.
we,
Right.
we don't really. In my mind, it's like 5 years before. You know, um, but we can never come out and say that. So one of the challenges was, well, what do we do with technology? You know, like in the '90s, the technology was very different than it was, say, 5 years ago.
Right.
So we
Right.
just sort of very gently skirt all that. You know?
So no, an iPhone's not going to may necessarily pop up in Ben Reilly Spider-Man or just quietly.
You know, I was even like talking to my editors, like, well, what about cell phones? What kind of cell phone? You know,
Yeah.
that kind of thing is just so we're just very gentle with that. We don't want to put in anything that's so definitively of a specific time. But
Mm.
in my head, this story is taking place maybe 5 years ago.
Well, I mean, it's not, it doesn't seem too different than let's say in DC world where you have a character like Superman, who we all know fought in near World War II in the 1940s. The character was around, but also you're not going to have reference in current Superman to, oh, remember when I smacked punched out a Nazi back in the day.
Right,
You know,
exactly.
you
Well, I
just kind
know.
of assume, you know.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, there's a suspension of disbelief that you have to have with any of these stories.
Mm. So, what can listeners look forward to in the future of Ben Reilly Spider-Man? Is this going to be an ongoing? Is this a mini series?
It's a 5-issue miniseries that will take Ben on a very complete journey. You know, starting from where everything will be discussed with a real arc of growth and change. There we see a lot of classic Spider-Man villains, and then we will eventually see the villain behind the villains in a few issues. And I think it will be unexpected. That's all I can say.
Well,
I kind of didn't expect it, so and I wrote it.
So, are all the issues completed and out? Oh, not out there, but obviously completed as far as writing goes.
I'm finishing up the last issue this month.
Like I said, it really, the first issue really I think was impressive. I mean, there's so many character beats that really were genius, and I think it definitely shows just how great of a writer you are and have been.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I really appreciate that.
It's definitely my pleasure. And Mr. DeMatteis, it was a pleasure talking with you.
Great to talk to you as well.
Like I said, I enjoyed talking Spider-Man with you, and you are definitely the legend to talk to about Spider-Man.
Well, you take good care and
you
stay safe and healthy.
And you as well, sir. Have a fantastic day.
All right, you too.